Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of episode 4 of season 3 of Lower Decks. And I think it was an okay episode. There was a funny reference in the very beginning, poking fun at the TNG episode Masks, which is one of the worst episodes of that show. Even though I think the idea of that episode isn't really that bad, it was the execution which was terrible, because everything looked so cheap in that episode. The idea was that some alien probe is transforming the Enterprise into an alien city, and the data is possessed by hundreds of different personalities, one of which is the goddess of that ancient civilization. And so the idea itself actually has some potential, but the execution was so terrible, everything looked so cheap. Whenever they tried to show a set of the ship that was transformed into something, they just added a bunch of strange rocks and vines to the set, and that's it. So that wasn't really that impressive. It didn't really look alien. It all looked way too simplistic and cheap looking. And Brent Spiner's acting, which usually was brilliant, but in that specific episode, I think even the actor admitted that it was one of his worst performances. He said he wasn't given enough time to prepare because he was basically supposed to play a dozen different characters in one episode, like a split personality kind of story. I think even Stargate SG-1 did something similar in an episode when Daniel was also possessed by a lot of people and was also playing as them. And recently there was that movie with James McAvoy, who played a bunch of different characters, and he did it in a good way. So that's why I say that episode actually had a lot of potential if it was done well, but the execution was very poor, and that's why it didn't really work, and it's a terrible episode. The only way to enjoy it is to look at it as unintentional comedy because of how silly a lot of parts of it are. So anyway, they kind of poke fun at it when they show the captain was possessed by a mask and is kind of flying through the ship and transforming the ship into an ancient city, and everything looks exactly like in that TNG episode. Boimler's little guitar transforms into the same kind of stone artifact like in that episode. And the one thing that kind of annoyed me a little bit is that they said that the mask itself possessed her, and that's what gave her those magic powers to transform the ship, and yet that's not how it worked like in the TNG episode. The mask actually didn't have any power. It was a mask which Data himself made, and later Picard made a similar mask and put it on, but the mask didn't give them any powers. It's not like in that Jim Carrey movie, The Mask, in which the mask itself was magical and was giving him powers. So it's not the way it worked in that TNG episode, and so it's kind of a mistake here when Mariner says that the mask possessed the captain and gave her those magical powers to fly around the ship. So it's not exactly the same. We can explain it away by saying maybe Mariner misunderstood the situation, or maybe it's a different alien probe that caused it and it has different rules, maybe a more advanced probe or whatever. And so we can explain it away. I don't really mind it. It's just something I want to point out. And the scene also served to point out that the lower decks are not really happy with their living conditions, because they're basically living in a corridor and constantly there's a lot of chaos on the ship. And so there's some kind of lottery going on in which some of the lower decks will get to have their own rooms, and they overhear the Delta Shift guys, who I think we saw in season 1, they were like the evil mirror version of our characters because they are so similar and yet kind of more evil, and they never get to see them or interact with them because they're the Delta Shift, they're doing their duties at a different time. And Tandy overhears them that they are planning to rig that lottery so that they will win, and so she tells the others, and then they want to do it themselves to even it out. And then they go through the bowels of the ship, and the parts of the ship still have those vines and stuff, which I think they tried to explain that it's part of the hydroponics bay or something. I think it would have been much simpler to simply say these are the remnants of whatever that alien probe did to the ship when parts of the ship were transformed into the alien city and they were repairing it. They could have said that some parts of the ship are still transformed, and that would have been a better explanation. And they also showed us that some of those planes affected Mariner and Boimler in a hallucinogenic way, and they showed the scene from their point of view as if they're on drugs, and that kind of reminded me of some of the scenes in Star Trek Discovery when they often show off what happens when you're on drugs, and I even criticized it, saying why is the new Trek always kind of promoting the idea that being on drugs is fun and interesting and all of that. So I can remember complaining about it, so that scene reminded me of that. And there was also a scene in which they go into the holodeck and everything is black and white, like in the old movies. And maybe this is a reference to those early TNG episodes in which they often went into the holodeck into that time period. Only it wasn't black and white then, and I don't really like the black and white stuff. I think Voyager did that in some episodes, in which in the holodeck, when you play as if you're in old movies, you also make it as if everything is black and white. I never really like that. I prefer color, honestly. But the scene itself was kind of entertaining, the way that they enjoy violence, and so they go into the holodeck to shoot people and all of that. And then they also turned off the holodeck safeties, and so the bullets become deadly and they almost hit Boimler. And next they go into the deflector dish, which was also fun to see from the inside, and apparently there's no gravity there and they're kind of floating around. And just then some asteroids almost collide with the ship, and someone suggested shooting them, and then Jack said, no, we have a deflector dish for that. And I was almost clapping when I heard that, because one of my complaints about the recent Star Trek shows is that they forgot all about things like the deflector dish and what it's supposed to do, and they would just collide with stuff in space, and they never bothered to use a tractor beam or the deflector dish. And so I was almost clapping my hands when I heard that, when someone actually remembers that they have a deflector dish and what it's supposed to be used for. And my only issue with that is when they showed it getting activated, it just showed shields forming in front of the ship, and also the shields apparently just vaporizing those asteroids. And so that annoyed me a little bit, because it's not exactly the way it's supposed to work. The original idea of the deflector dish was that it was kind of sending out a beam far into space to deflect objects in the path of the ship. So it's not supposed to be destroying those objects, just moving them aside to clear a path for the ship, especially at warp. And the shields are something different. It's not exactly the same thing. And in early TNG, they would often say raise shields and deflectors, as if it's two different things. And later on in the show, I guess to simplify things, they only said shields up. They didn't really mention the deflectors that much. And so the blame, I guess, is with the older shows as well, that they kind of mixed things together or confused them or just forgot about them. So I don't entirely blame the new Trek shows, even though they were the stupidest ones, in which they even forgot they have shields or tractor beams or anything at all, and they would just collide with stuff in space to get through it. And also they would drop out of warp in the last possible second, just a few meters out of colliding with something. And so that's something that kind of annoyed me in the recent shows. And so I still give credit to this episode for at least mentioning the deflector dish and what it's supposed to be doing. And also it was cool to see it from the inside. When it got activated, it started kind of spinning on the inside, and they barely managed to escape it, and they made a rope out of their clothing. And so that part kind of reminds me of Enterprise, in which everyone were always losing their clothing to have a sexy scene. And at some point they meet the Delta Shift guys, and then they sit and talk with them, and it appears as if they're bonding with them and becoming friendly with them, but then the Delta Shift guys betrayed them, so it was all an act. And then they try to get into that room, and then our guys do manage to get there first, but then they realize there's only one room available, and they realize they don't want to split up, and so they give it up and return to the lower decks, and only later realize that they could have all gotten into that room together, and so it was a missed opportunity. So the Delta Shift guys did get that room, but hey, at least they got rid of them. At least they wouldn't be seeing them as often, I guess. And there's also a B-plot in which the engineers of the ship are sent into a ship which specializes in relaxation, and it's run by those same aliens with 3 hands as that other ship in which all the mutants and freaks get sent into. So that was in a different episode, and here it's a ship run by those aliens, but it's all about relaxation of overworked Starfleet officers, and all the engineers of the ship are all tired because of all that work they had to do rebuilding the ship after it got transformed into an alien city. So the captain orders the engineers to go there, and yet they cannot stop engineering. They keep trying to invent things or fix things, and then the captain herself becomes stressed out, and then the engineers invent a device that can just fix it. I was expecting a twist in which they will reveal that the device doesn't actually do anything, it just makes you think it did, like a placebo effect. And so I didn't like that easy kind of reset button solution in the end. I did enjoy those parts of that ship with all the different rooms of different treatments, and one of them is playing with puppies, which reminded me of an episode of season 2 of TNG, when they had puppies on the ship, and in a different room they have a mud bath, which reminds me of the TNG episode when Worf and Loxana were going into mud baths in the holodeck. And in a different room we see a Klingon who's enjoying doing what Klingons love doing. And so it was kind of funny to see all the different ways of relaxing, and the engineers being unable to relax because they cannot shut off their brains. And there was a scene in which they were supposed to be doing something in the sand, and then they just drew some schematics of something. That also reminds me of that same TNG episode Masks, when Data was given an assignment by Troy to do a sculpture, and then he made a data pad with a bunch of stuff on it, and so that reminded me of that as well. So overall it was an okay episode with some funny moments. I did enjoy the reference to the episode Masks, even though it wasn't entirely accurate. And I like how this show is not ignoring the silliest parts of Star Trek, but instead they're deliberately taking those silliest ideas or moments and turning them into something good by making a parody out of it. We actually get something good out of those terrible episodes, and so that's a good thing. Even though this show is far from perfect, but it's still fun and okay in my opinion. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss all of this in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.